Almost to say that you can't be both a boy and a man at the same time, right? And there's something a former colleague of mine would like to say, where he like say sometimes you just gotta pick a struggle, you know. Welcome to the Architecting Through Life podcast, where we dig into principles for building ourselves up as individuals while navigating the realities of this thing called life. The podcast is dedicated to young adults and anyone with the deep hunger to grow in their journey of being all that they were created to be. My name is Simon Gubeni, and with each episode I'll be discussing thoughts and insights drawn from life, from the Bible, from unique experiences, as well as from other great minds and mentors. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I do hope that you'll enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast. Welcome. If it's your first time tuning in, thanks so much for listening in. If it's not your first time, as usual, I really appreciate you coming back to listen. In today's episode, we're basically looking at the third installment in our series of thoughts on the topic of manhood. We've basically done 2 parts already on thoughts on manhood. And I really appreciated the great feedback and actually the surprising responses I've received on the last 2 episodes, especially both from males and females, both men and women. And I really, really appreciated some of the reflections, feedback, some of the challenges as well. And it basically, it helps a lot in also my own personal growth, which I appreciate a lot as I do these episodes. Maybe it may be important for me to do a little bit of a recap on the previous episodes of the series. So in part 1, basically we looked at the meaning of manhood, or what manhood is, and we basically summed it up as being an adult human male, right? Looking at the definition of manhood, where adult basically is the idea of maturation or growing up, being distinct from a child. Being human basically is a reference to one's nature and being created in the image of God with certain strengths and limitations and characteristics such as a mind, spirituality, passions, being distinct from an animal basically, and then being a male, which comes with various real biological and temperamental traits, right? And these distinguish a male from a female, right? So that's an adult human male. In part 2, basically looked at the essence of manhood, which is basically what comes with being an adult human male, right? Which is being proactive and self-controlled in the context of truth and responsibility. That's what we summed up the essence of manhood as being, right? And in that episode, we went to a lot of depth on what it means to be proactive, what it means to be self-controlled, and what is truth and responsibility, right? And that idea of the essence of manhood basically is, I would consider it as a framework of thinking about this idea of manhood. And I'll keep going back to the framework now and again, even when we consider, like today's episode, how we can distinguish between being a child and a man, right? And also, as a framework, offers us something like a compass on how we can go from boyhood to manhood, basically. And in today's episode, we're basically going to use that framework as the essence of manhood to basically look at how we distinguish between boyhood and manhood, right? Or rather, covering what I'll call childish things, right? So I want to go back to a passage I've been referring to in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. And I'll go back to it a couple of times, actually, where Paul, the writer, writes in the New Testament that when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Right? And the first thing to note there is that the author draws a line of distinction basically between boyhood and manhood, right? That these are distinct and separate things. They're not the same, right? So he says, when I was a child, I did X, Y, and Z, but now I'm no longer a child because I'm now a man, right? Almost to say that you can't be both a boy and a man at the same time, right? And there's something a former colleague of mine would like to say, where he like say sometimes you just gotta pick a struggle, you know, as though both of them are a struggle and you can't face the struggle of both at the same time. And the second thing to know from the text is the idea that entrance into manhood comes after putting away those childish things, right? So he says, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I understood as a child, and I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things, right? Because manhood comes after putting away childish things, right? And yeah, here we want to look at this idea of what could help us define what those childish things are, right? The childish things that need to be put away. How can we set up a framework to kind of identify and think about them, right? Could ask ourselves what are the things that make up childish things, right? And note that the text shows that this isn't necessarily a biological thing, right? He's saying, when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought as a child, I understood as a child. But when I became a man, I put those things away, right? So the idea of what he would describe as childhood is in essence of how a child would speak, how a child would understand or reason, and how a child would think, right? It has to do with thoughts, understanding, and speech, right? And so what way of thinking or understanding or of speaking can basically be regarded as childish, right? And that's what we're getting into, right? But before we get into that question, let's think about something that happens in us when we're children, right? Beginning to grow. By us, I mean like boys, but obviously I think it applies just as equally to girls, I suppose, right? We're talking about children. That something happens when you begin to grow out of childhood, right? In the previous episode, I talked about how children haven't learned how to distinguish between right and wrong, and that they're constantly under a guardian or a tutor, right? As it says in Galatians, because they basically don't know how to rule themselves, right? They're essentially dependent on others, right? Such as a guardian or a parent. But from a young age as boys, we begin to grow up with this desire to do whatever we want to do, right? To be in charge of our own lives, to do whatever we feel like doing. And it usually happens around the age of between 10, maybe to 16 years of age, at that period that we would otherwise call adolescence, where there's this desire to be independent and to establish our own identity. And in fact, part of what makes children look forward to being an adult is because of the belief that when they're adults, they won't have anyone to tell them what to do, right? But that's before they discover the wonderful adventures of adulting, right? But as children, we basically grow up wanting to be in charge of our own lives, our own ways, and we could even label this as a desire to be proactive and self-controlled, right? To use this description that I've been using. But when we're children, we don't always realize that there's a difference between what I'll call self-will and self-government, right? Self-will basically is stubbornly and willfully holding on to your own desires, your own ideas, usually without caring about how it would affect the next person, right, or those around you. Self-government, on the other hand, especially as it applies to individuals, is more closely aligned to this idea of self-control, right? The ability to function without the intervention or reliance on other people, right? So on outside forces. It's basically a degree of independence, right? So in our childhood years, the desire to grow up, to have your own way, it often tends to fall into the side of being self-willed, right? Of not regarding how your actions or basically your behavior would affect other people, right? So those who you're dependent on or around, right? And this is where, as a child growing up, basically you want what you want, or want what we want when we want it, without a real understanding of its implications both now and in the future. And that's why there's this idea in the book of Proverbs that goes something along the lines of train up a child in the way that he should go, and then when he is old, he will not depart from it. Right? So that's Proverbs 22, verse 6. And the idea is that a child, for as long as he is a child, is generally unaware of the principles that should govern his life. Right? He doesn't yet understand the truth, and as a result of that, he still needs to be trained. Right? And so it says, train up a child in the way that he should go. Right? And so he still needs training and guidance and education. And when I say he doesn't yet understand the truth and its results, I basically mean that when he's being told about the way that he should go, right? That's what I would refer to as truth, and you'll get why I mean that as we go, right? So it says, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he is old, however, right, when he's a man, after having been trained in the way that he should go, right, he will have internalized those principles for himself to the extent that it can be said that he won't depart from them, right? He would have internalized them to the point where it says, when he is old, he will not depart from them. They've now become his own. He's no longer dependent on someone outside of him to train him in those things, right? In the way that he should go, right? In those principles, what I would call the truth. So the idea is basically that manhood comes with putting away childish things. And one of those is being self-willed, right? While not submitting yourself to the way that you should go, right? Basically wanting one's own way, wanting to do things for themselves independently, but without regard for the things that define the way that he should go, right? Those principles, or what I would call truth, right? So while a child, or what I would call an adolescent, may want to do what he wants, right, whenever he wants, maturation comes with realizing that not everything that we want, or the things that we want to do, are necessarily good or beneficial for us in the long term, right? Or even like in the immediate term, right? That maturation comes with, yes, I want what I want. I want to do my own thing. I want to, be in charge of my own life. I want to live my own way. But it comes with realizing that not everything that we want to do is necessarily good, right? As an example, I remember one night around 10 o'clock at night having an argument with a 6-year-old young man who basically refused to go to bed, right? And started crying and almost throwing a tantrum because he wanted to stay up and watch cartoons, right? And he became very emotional because he wants what he wants, right? Despite the consequences that come with that, and not realizing that in the long term, a habit of, as a 6-year-old sleeping far beyond the night to watch cartoons won't be beneficial for your mental and I think even physical development, right? It's the idea that it's not good for you, right? And maybe even said that maybe even adults might need to be taught that, right? Not to throw shade on anyone, but it's the idea that maturation comes with realizing that not everything about ourselves or about what we want to do is good, right? And so it's wiser to subject ourselves to a greater system of governments or governance or of truth, right? Which is good for our well-being, right? Sort of principles and rules, or principles, so to say, to ground our lives in. Right? So maturation or maturity comes with searching out and subjecting ourselves to a higher system of governance than myself, right? Than my own feelings, than my own emotions at the time, right? In order to be a better man, right? In order for one to live by the truth and enjoy life more, I guess. So when a child says, I want what I want, it's about what they want now, right? Based on their feelings, their desires, their appetites and lusts. And they want it without consideration of whether it's good for them or not, right? That's a child, right? So I'd summarize all the above in view of the framework I described earlier from the essence of manhood as being where one of the marks of childhood is a desire to be proactive and self-controlled, right? To be independent, to be in charge of our own life, while overlooking the reality of responsibility and truth, right? And this is often where we find ourselves in that age of what we'd call adolescence, right? Generally, and yeah, maybe it's worth getting into that. So the idea is that childhood and adolescence, in childhood and adolescence, we basically want to be proactive and self-controlled, right? We want to be in charge of our own lives, but without submission to truthful principles, without taking up the responsibility for our actions and how they affect others, right? So not regarding the idea of truth and responsibility. And in adolescence, you basically want to live your own way and do your own thing while not regarding the fact that there are laws and principles which govern the life and that your actions have consequences which you must account for. And I don't mean laws or rules in the sense of like rules and instructions as you must do this, you must do that, but I'm intentional in my use of the word truth, right? Like the fact that it is true that you reap what you sow, or it's true that hard work produces results, right? Or it's true that if you neglect your health, you will get sick, right? That's truth, right? And so, being childish or childhoodness or childhood rather comes with wanting to live one's own way without regard for truth, right? And that's one of the marks of childhood or of childhood things, right? Where the idea of wanting to be independent, right, to be proactive and self-control without a regard or an acknowledgement or submission to truth and without taking up responsibility. Right? Now, one interesting to note or to think about is the fact that the Bible doesn't seem to add this long transition period between childhood and manhood, right? This period that we would call adolescence. Right? The idea of that transition period, that concept of adolescence, is something that actually arose in around the late or mid 1800s, right? The late modern era, right? And the text I cited earlier, where the author says, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I understood as a child." It's like it's either you're a child or a man, right? There's no "when I was a child, I became an intermediate between a child and a man, then I became a man." It's when I was a child, I became a man and I put away childish things, right? It's an either or situation, right? And I think there may be an important reason as to why it is that way, right? As to why the Bible and I think in fact most of history prior to the late modern era didn't view maturity as involving this long transition period into manhood, right? This pre-adulthood stage that we would call adolescence, right? That the Bible doesn't seem to describe that, and even most of yeah, ancient history. And I think it stems from the recognition that various aspects that come with maturity or manhood are interlinked, right? That they necessarily work together. Right? Now, what do I mean by that? In order to successfully carry out responsibilities, as an example, right, and to faithfully live by what I've called the truth, you and I need to be proactive and self-controlled, right? Our responsibilities cannot be fulfilled by being passive or by a lack of self-control, right? And all of those have to work together. Right? So if we were to take some parts, for example, being proactive and self-controlled, like independence, while neglecting others, such as truth or responsibility, it would be what I would call childish, right? Childish or a childish thing. And I think that there's an important thing to note there. Right? So imagine if we were to say we were being proactive, right? We weren't governed by our circumstances, but we weren't self-controlled, right? Like, i.e., you couldn't restrain yourself. That also wouldn't be too effective, right? There's actually a text that says a man without self-control is like a city without walls, right? A profound thought there. Right? Or imagine if one were given responsibilities, but they couldn't or they wouldn't be proactive, right? They wouldn't take initiative, or they were dependent on others for their thinking. Right? Those things necessarily have to work together, right? Being proactive and self-controlled in the context of truth and responsibility. And that's the idea of why I believe there wasn't this long transition period between childhood and manhood where you are some parts child and some parts man. Right? Now that's not to say that you go in a flash from boyhood to manhood and then there's you're done from there and that there's no further development necessary. Right? In fact, there's growth even in maturation. Right? There's growth even in manhood, but this is a growth where one becomes more and more competent and capable in their exercise of proactive self-control, in their responsibilities and their understanding of the truth. Right? As their responsibilities grow and as the understanding of truth grows. Right? But I'll get into that more in the next episode. So, more of a quick recap. In 1 Corinthians 13:11, it says there, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, right? And that there's a distinction where it says, when I became a man, I put away childish things. Right? So manhood comes with putting away childish things. And one of those childish things, or one of the marks of childhood, is wanting to be independent or proactive and self-control while shunning the reality of responsibilities, right? And the reality of truth, right? When I want, like a child, to live my own way or to do my own thing, while refusing to accept responsibility or to search for and recognize those principles of truth, those are, I would imagine, parts of the childish things that the author is saying he had laid aside. Right? He had recognized that there's responsibility that is directly within my sphere of influence, that there's truth that I must live up to, and I can be self-controlled and proactive in living and fulfilling all of those. Right? Now, say one realizes that they have some childish things and that they have some childish tendencies. Right? How can I put them away? Right? Like what the author of the text is saying. How can I, when he says I became a man, I put away childish things? That's what I'll get into the fourth part of the fourth and final part of the series of thoughts on manhood. For now, that's it for today's episode of the podcast. I would love to get your thoughts, comments, feedback, challenges as well. Right? I always welcome disagreement because it helps me grow. I always appreciate it a lot. For now, my name is Simon and I'm wishing you all the best on your journey of architecting through life. Much love. Thank you for listening to the episode that you've just heard on the Architecting Through Life podcast. If you found it valuable, please kindly do me the favor of sharing it and maybe leaving a comment if you'd like. I'd really like to get your thoughts, any impact that you might feel it may have, and do feel free to share it with someone else so that it can be a benefit to them as well. Thank you so much for your time, and do join us again on the next episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast.